there are no red lines. Putin can huff and he can puff and he can make all the noise he wants to make, but at the end of the day, it's just huffing and puffing. And so I think that we should be giving the Ukrainians everything they ask for and everything they need to cause Putin untold damage, particularly to his military infrastructure and to his economy, because that's going to be the only moment that he comes to the table and agrees a ceasefire. He's not going to agree a ceasefire if he's not under duress, and he's not currently under duress.
Hi, I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to the Trump Report on Times Radio. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on our YouTube channel, and you can also listen and follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Joining me today on the show is Sir Bill Browder. Bill, we always appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on the Trump Report.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start then today, Bill, with fresh from celebrating the brokering of his 20-point Gaza peace plan between Israel and Hamas, Donald Trump has suggested that he might be willing to now send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine in what he described would be a new step of aggression in the war. What is your reaction to that possible news?
Well, on the surface, it looks like a great announcement. Ukraine needs all the help they can get. They need to strike targets, military targets, and economic targets inside of Russia. The Tomahawk missile is a very effective tool for doing that. The one reservation I have, which is also intimated in some of these announcements, is that Trump would, or the United States would ask for restrictions on targets that could be hit. And one of the things which I found so frustrating about the U.S. military aid to Ukraine during the Biden administration is that they would provide quite a bit of aid, but then they would put these very onerous restrictions on the Ukrainians to say that they could only use ATACMS missiles inside the territory of Ukraine, which I think is kind of crazy. If you have a foreign invader invading your territory and you can only hit them when they're in your territory, that kind of defeats the purpose. And in a certain way, Trump's initial foray into Ukraine, which was to withdraw military aid, gave the Ukrainians absolute freedom of movement to do what they wanted to do. And we've all seen that without the U.S. restricting Ukraine on hitting targets inside of Russia, they can be quite effective. And of course, we're all watching on a daily basis as Ukraine, using just drone technology for the most part, has immobilized and destroyed somewhere between 20 and 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity. And there are now fuel shortages and all sorts of other economic problems as a result inside of Russia. So what I'm worried about is Trump providing Tomahawks and then saying, you've got to give us a list of every target you want to hit in Russia, and we may reject those targets. And so let's see what happens. But that's the issue going forward.
Because we know the Tomahawks, I think they can range from between sort of 1,500 to 1,800 miles, which would hypothetically mean Ukraine could strike Moscow. But are you saying you'd imagine Moscow might be on that list of do not strike targets?
Well, I don't know what's going to be on the list or what's not going to be on the list, but I know that having a list creates a problem, because there's this fantasy that if you hit Russia, you're going to escalate, and all of a sudden we're going to be in a terrible nuclear war, which has never proved to be true. We know from the very beginning of the war that so many things could have been done. First, it was tanks, then it was ATACMS missiles, then it was F-16s, and everybody said, no, we can't do that. That's going to escalate. That's going to cause problems. No, we can't. And then we ended up doing it. It didn't escalate. It didn't cause problems. And if we had done it earlier, we would have saved lives and perhaps changed the outcome of the war. And so I don't know what's going to be discussed in these meetings. I don't know what restrictions will be put in place. That's the main reservation I have. The headline looks good. The details may not be so good.
Mm. So is there any cause for concern then? Because we know that Joe Biden's administration kind of famously didn't ever send any Tomahawks to Ukraine. So if this is a red line for Moscow, what does that realistically mean for the war and the world?
There's no such thing as a red line for Moscow. Moscow doesn't have the capacity to create red lines. Their big trump card is nuclear retaliation. But the reason why Putin hasn't used nuclear weapons is the same reason why every other Russian and Soviet leader has never used nuclear weapons, because using nuclear weapons leads to mutually assured destruction. And so there's sort of an absolute um, practical prohibition on using nuclear weapons. And otherwise, there are no red lines. Putin can huff and he can puff and he can make all the noise he wants to make, but at the end of the day, it's just huffing and puffing. And so I think that we should be giving the Ukrainians everything they ask for and everything they need to cause Putin untold damage, particularly to his military infrastructure and to his economy, because that's going to be the only moment that he comes to the table and agrees a ceasefire. He's not going to agree a ceasefire if he's not under duress, and he's not currently under duress.
Because you mentioned the Ukrainian-made drones here, but if the US does send these Tomahawks, that is a game changer, isn't it? That's a level up from Ukrainian drones.
I'm not sure anything is a game changer per se. Everything adds more pressure onto Russia. If they have the Tomahawks and they can use those Tomahawks to destroy arms production, if they can use it to destroy military bases, planes, or oil, oil exploration, production, refining capacity. Those are the types of things which then adds more and more pressure onto Putin. And I think that altogether, putting that in place, other things, other military aggressive, offensive military equipment, plus going after Russia's oil revenue, those are all things that put together can put Putin in a position where he has no choice but to negotiate. But right now he's not in that position. And if you take President Trump at his word, he wants to force a negotiation, and that would be the thing. Those would be the things to do to force a negotiation.
Yeah, both yourself and other contributors have mentioned sort of the oil refineries on this show before. Now, peace through strength has become sort of something of a doctrine for the Trump administration. I think he even used the words in his address to Israel earlier this week. Do you think we've seen that yet applied in his approach to Russia?
I think we've seen just the opposite. So Trump has come in. What has he done practically? He practically has withdrawn financial military aid for Ukraine. There have been no more military aid packages proposed by the Trump administration or approved by Congress since he's been president. There's still some remaining U.S. military aid that was approved by Biden and approved by Congress that's coming into Ukraine, but that's going to run out. He has not imposed crippling sanctions of any sort on Russia. In fact, I'm not aware of any particular sanctions he's imposed at all. And so those are the two things that would be considered strength. Neither of them have been done. Now, I would be the biggest supporter of any actions he takes which deals with both those two issues, and hopefully he will.
Trump is expected to meet with President Zelensky at the White House on Friday, as we've just mentioned. We've seen the kind of relationship between those two, at least publicly, change since that infamous Oval Office meeting in February. What will you be looking out for and hoping to hear on Friday from that meeting?
Well, I mean, first of all, the fact that the meeting is happening, I think, is an encouraging sign. It wasn't scheduled a week ago.
Yeah, I think this will be the third time they've met since January, which is it's definitely an increase.
So having the meeting is good. Trump is on a high right now. He's actually, he's a big braggart. He brags about things that he has nothing to do with, but his success in Israel is absolutely his success, and I think that he actually discovered the joy of heroism. It was heroic what he did with this whole conflict in Israel, and I think that he probably all of the endorphins are shooting off in his body, and he's feeling the glory of doing something heroic. And I think that he's probably on a heroism high, and he probably wants to um, repeat the feeling with Ukraine. And so the fact that he hastily organized this meeting, I think, is a good sign. Um, we don't know what's going to be discussed, and it's impossible to really predict because nothing is predictable in the Trump world. But the fact that the meeting is happening is good, and it's happening in a good context because he made these statements at the United Nations, completely changing his views, saying that Ukraine could win the war. That's a lot different than the view that he took at the Oval Office with Zelensky, where he berated him and said, "You have no cards." So we just have to see. But trying to predict what Trump is going to do is a foolish game because he never does. He's the most unpredictable president the United States has ever had, and perhaps that's his that may be his superpower in this situation. If we can't predict it, Putin probably can't predict it. Zelensky can't predict it, but maybe he'll do something which will be helpful to Ukraine, and we just have to hope that that's the case.
Yeah, you mentioned that hero narrative. Are you confident that he'll sort of keep that up? Because even if he does make this pivot and is serious about pushing for peace in Ukraine, like, we can only sort of judge the president on his actions. And in the last week, we've seen, like you said, his great work with brokering that peace deal. But one of the criticisms I think people have raised is that they kind of have this ingrained idea that he won't have the attention to see that through. Or, he's got this deal now, but he'll lose interest in a year's time. Are you concerned that that might happen on Ukraine?
Um, well, Trump has the the attention span of a fruit fly, and so in all issues he moves from one thing to the other But some of these things don't require intense attention at all times. Some of these things require a policy decision. Supply Tomahawks and allow the Ukrainians to use them for whatever purpose. Once that decision has been made, it's not like Donald Trump has to be micromanaging it. Um, if Ukraine needs more resources, perhaps provide a military aid package, approve it, let Congress vote on it, and then it's done. This is not something that requires Trump to be sitting at his desk every night, watching everything that comes through. And so I don't think that it's necessary for him to be detail oriented. He just needs to make some big, bold, supportive decisions, and if he makes those decisions will have an impact.
But it does require, specifically with the oil refineries and crippling sanction, it does require the will of the Western world, right? I mean, people have sort of been calling for these for the last 3 years, and we still haven't quite got them yet.
Well, on the oil refineries, and just to summarize why it's so important, 8 oil refineries, 2 in China, 4 in India, and 2 in Turkey, basically buy all the Russian oil that's sold out of Russia, and that's adds up to $300 or $400 billion of money for the Russian economy, which is what Putin lives on to fund his war. If we were to tell those refineries not to buy the oil, and you'll be punished and can't do business with the West if you buy that oil, and they don't buy that oil, Putin is out of business. And of course, that's a really powerful argument. It's not something that's Trump's decision alone. It's a decision of the European Union, of the UK, of Canada, Australia, Japan. But if all the allies were to work together on that particular decision, that would end the war, I believe.
Hmm. But what is that reticence? Is it a financial one?
Well, the main reason why it hasn't been done so far is that there is a fear, not an insignificant fear, that if Russia is a major supplier of oil to the world, and you tell all the buyers of that oil you can't buy it, that effectively takes a lot of oil off the market, takes a lot of supply off the market. Demand is the same, and the oil price goes up. Now, interestingly, if you look at OPEC oil production in the last few weeks, it's increased a lot. And if you look at the oil price, it's starting to go down. And so I don't know if there's been conversations taking place behind the scenes. I would hope that there would be with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, who are now all partners with America on the Middle East peace, where Trump could be making these demands, and maybe they're actually following through on them. Nobody has indicated why they've increased oil production like they have, but this may be a prelude. Hopefully, it's a prelude to a strong policy decision to cut off Russia from the oil markets, which would then truly have the effect of putting Putin in an untenable position, and then he'd have to negotiate a ceasefire.
Yeah, is you said an untenable position. Is that, in your mind, the only sort of proven way to help him negotiate?
Well, there's two things. One is giving Ukraine offensive weapons so that they can pummel Russia's economy and military capacity, and two is to take away the money that Russia has to conduct its war. If you do those two things in parallel and effectively, then Putin will be in a position where he's not pounding his chest and saying, "I can carry on into perpetuity on this." And the time is limited for us because we're living in a world of democracies. Putin's not he's not a democratically elected leader. He's a dictator, and so he doesn't have to worry about midterms and the next elections and so on. Whereas in all of our countries in the West, all of us supporters of Ukraine, we have all sorts of things to worry about. We have in France, uh, I think we're on our fourth government, and Marine Le Pen, who's funded by the Russians, is waiting in the wings. In Germany, you have the AfD, again, a pro-Russian party with the most votes. You've got a Czech prime minister who's just come in, who's anti-NATO, may not be pro-Russia, but anti-support for Ukraine. You've got Dutch parliamentary elections where you have Geert Wilders, who's a far right person, and so you've got a lot of stuff going on our side, which one or two of these things could end up changing the course of how the West supports Ukraine. And so time is not on our side, and we need to give the Ukrainians enough so that time is not on Putin's side either.
Would you have said, though, when Trump took office for the first time, I don't think we could necessarily say that he was pro-Russia, but he was a little bit more reticent on Ukraine. And yet, the longer that he's sort of been dealing with both countries, he's found it so difficult to deal with the Kremlin. We have seen that shift, position shift from him.
That's absolutely the case. And I can remember everyone was panicking about Giorgia Meloni, saying, "Well, she comes from a right-wing party, and her coalition partners are this guy Salvini, who is pictured in Moscow taking or allegedly taking money from Russian sources." But she's turned out to be one of the best prime ministers in Europe when it comes to supporting Ukraine and being tough on Russia. So it's very difficult to predict too much. But we've also seen how damaging it can be. Look at what Viktor Orban has been doing in the European Union. He's the prime minister of Hungary, and he's using Hungary's position in the European Union to veto all sorts of policies towards Ukraine. Hungary's population is 1% of the EU population, but he's effectively got a veto over all sorts of decisions in the EU. And so that's the fear that I have and many other people have about all these different right-wing candidates. Perhaps most of them will actually turn out to be okay, but all it takes is one or two of them, and life can be very difficult for all of us if they veto policies that help Ukraine finally win this war.
I just want to ask if there's a danger to extrapolate too much from the work that Donald Trump has done on the Gaza peace plan in the last sort of week and a half. Because we know, in that situation is kind of unique in that we know that the US and Israel are very close allies, while also Hamas was in a situation where they had reason to stop the destruction that we were seeing in Gaza. With Russia and Ukraine at the moment, is there a will to end that war?
No, there's no will. So Putin needs the war in order to stay in power. If he's not in power, he ends up going to jail, losing his money, and probably dying. So for him, he needs the war to stay in power. And the only reason that he would ever stop the war is if it's just going so catastrophically that he thinks he's going to lose power by staying in the war. And the Ukrainians have to fight this war because, as painful as the war is, it's a lot less painful than Russian occupation. And why is Russian occupation so bad? All we need to do is look at the images from Bucha. This was an occupied city near Kiev that was then freed. And what we saw in Bucha was that every woman in Bucha was raped, and the men were herded together, hands tied behind their backs, tortured, and then shot in the back of the head. And then the children were all kidnapped and taken to Russia. And so for the Ukrainians, no matter how painful war is and how terrible it is, and the terrorism that goes on every day, it's infinitely better than Russian occupation. So there's no chance that the Ukrainians are going to surrender, and there's no chance that Putin is going to stop the war unless he thinks being in the war is riskier for him personally than not being at war. And he's not gotten there yet. And none of this is going to be because Trump and Putin are, quote, friends. This is going to be because there's so much pressure on Putin that he has no choice. He only responds to a boot on the throat, and that's what we have to do now.
So the Gaza peace plan was, an incredibly difficult piece of diplomacy. If we'll go back to the start of the conversation, if Trump is serious now about Ukraine, I mean, is this even more complicated?
Well, I think it's actually not that complicated. It's all about offensive weapons for Ukraine and punishing sanctions for Putin. It's just a question of and by the way, and a lot of allies with the whole Middle East story, it was probably much more complicated because there were so many different cross currents of argument. I think in the Russia Ukraine thing, it's black and white. There's an aggressor and there's a victim. Um, there was a brief period of time when Trump first came to power where he didn't recognize Ukraine's victimhood. He seems to now. Everybody else does. And so I think this is actually a simpler conflict to resolve in the sense that once we make our decision about how do we put pressure on Putin, we can just follow through on that. And then I think eventually he'll crack.
So, Bill Browder, thank you very much for joining us on the Trump Report.
Thank you.